All right, students, welcome to 29.3.5, the politics of polarization. So this one might go a little long, I hope not, but there's quite a lot of information to cover in here. So let's just jump right into it, okay? All right, so if you guys remember, in the 1968 election, we had three major candidates, which was kind of an abnormal thing in the 20th century to have three truly viable candidates run for president. One of the things, of course, that happened is that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated before the Democratic National Convention by Sirhan, which left a void in the party that needed to be filled. Bobby Kennedy was extraordinarily charismatic, and he probably had a legitimate shot at winning the presidency in 1968. So one of the things that comes about during this time is that there's two things that are really a big focus on, and those are, of course, the war in Vietnam, and then also how civil rights were being treated, and also kind of how to deal with, this is kind of the third underlying one that I talk about, also how to deal with kind of the social disruptions that had occurred throughout the 60s. Again, if you remember, college campuses were constantly full of protests. You had riots in major cities. There's a growth of drug use and criminal epidemics throughout the country. The 60s really lead into kind of a tumultuous time of the United States, and so some people are looking for solutions. So the three people, of course, if you guys remember, we have Richard Dick Nixon. Yes, and he usually went by Dick Nixon. He was very moderate on civil rights. He didn't really push one side or the other, because one thing that he was using, something called the Southern Strategy, where he was trying to get Southern Christian voters to really back his election. You have Herbert Humphreys, kind of the lukewarm, milky candidate that not a lot of people were really strong about, but he backed a lot of the civil rights legislation that was going on. And the Democrats really had an anti-war platform during this time frame, so he was pretty much, let's end this war. Dick Nixon, on the other hand, he's like, we're going to leave the war with peace and honor. Also, the other thing about Nixon, too, is he's really the law and order candidate. That's one thing he pushes first and foremost. He's like, this country is out of control. We really need to be aggressive and bring law and order to our major cities and bring peace throughout our country again. And then you have George Wallace, who's an independent. And if you guys remember, we talked a little bit about him, but he's really at that forefront of we need to roll back these, or at least stop these civil rights actions. He's really the kind of white backlash candidate, the one where he's going, we need to reestablish and reaffirm the quote-unquote traditional members of our society and make sure that they're successful. He's also very pro-war. And he really attacks Herbert Humphreys as one thing that he really targets. He's extremely anti-liberal. He still considers a lot of people on the far left or in the left as communists. So with Humphreys and Wallace being in there, it created this splitting of the vote, which made a very narrow popular vote victory for Nixon. But Wallace managed to siphon off enough votes that Richard Nixon won the Electoral College by over 300 votes. So he had a landslide Electoral College victory. So Nixon goes in very strong when he leaves the election, and he feels like he has a mandate to really start looking at making substantial changes. Now, there are a lot of things that really plague Nixon. Nixon is probably one of the most complicated presidents in the history of the United States. He's a fascinating character study. In fact, when it comes to autobiographies that being read about presidents, I've probably read 2 or 3 about Nixon just because I am fascinated. Not just biographies too, because he doesn't write multiple autobiographies. But I've read multiple biographies of Nixon too, just because of his unique perspective and ideas and how he functions as the chief executive, his diplomacy in Vietnam, his world diplomacy, his internal American policies, just really different across the board than a lot of presidents. Many of them seem him as a very conservative Republican, but he had very big ideas for social issues and wanting to attack those too. So he's kind of this amalgamism of a conservative liberal. So that's why I find Nixon fascinating. But the other thing that Nixon struggled with is that he was very paranoid. He had a lot of paranoia issues where he didn't trust a lot of people around him, and he really, it's a fascinating thing too to look at, is his view on the news media. Nixon, for a long time, he had very positive news coverage of him. Even in the early 1960s, in his run for governor, he was fairly well liked in the press. I mean, in fact, many newspapers backed him. Their editorial boards backed him for president. However, Nixon didn't like the media in return, and neither did Spiro Agnew, his vice president. In fact, Nixon was firmly convinced that the media was after him all the time. He felt like they didn't treat his political enemies with any scrutiny. He felt like he was always under a microscope, and other politicians, especially as he saw him, other liberal politicians, were given a pass by the media. And so he really goes on the defensive against the press all the time. I mean, his administration is hostile towards the media. Nixon himself is not pro-media. He doesn't give a whole lot of interviews right off the bat. And if he does, he's very combative with them. And so Nixon he really pushes back against him, which kind of creates problems for him later on when it starts coming into when we're going to talk about Whitewater. And so he's always looking out and trying to find the scapegoat in the media for problems where things are getting pushed out. And even more so, if you guys remember, the release of the Pentagon Papers and the pickup of it by the media really was damaging to him, even though he's not even really mentioned in the Pentagon Papers. It's more of LBJ and Kennedy. But he felt like it was a direct attack on him too, further driving this paranoia and distrust of the media. One of the things that start happening, if we remember again, Pentagon Papers, we just talk about that. There's a lot of leaks that start coming out of the White House, out of the Pentagon, out of other areas that should be secret and shouldn't be leaking information out. And some of those go around the ideas of Nixon and his increased bombing campaigns in Vietnam, how he starts to bomb Cambodia, which becomes very controversial. He's also just getting other things that are damaging to his foreign policies and his domestic policies. So Nixon he's becoming, again, more isolated and more paranoid again, that people are out to get him. So what he does is he hires a group of people that are known as plumbers, i.e. the people that fix the leaks that are coming out of all these different locations. And these plumbers are special investigators, former police officers, FBI agents, and the CIA agents. And these people work directly for Nixon. Now, if you're to study history at this point, people are going, oh, look, Nixon's so paranoid that he has this top secret group of investigators. Trust me, if you study history from even in the 1960s, even prior to that, going all the way back even to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, every president during that time frame had a collection of dirt finders that they always operated and had them doing opposition research, kind of spying on their enemies and spying on people within their own administrations to make sure that they're not causing damage to them. Nixon's use of them, though, is what gets him into trouble. So what we have is in 1972, Nixon runs for re-election. Now, Nixon during this time is extremely popular. Going into the election, it looks really good for him. Yet again, as we're talking about this extreme paranoia takes over Nixon, so he's really worried about what they could have on him or what could be out there that's damaging to him. Now, this is where things get muddled, okay? We're going to talk about a few things here, but we'll kind of go into just this election, then we'll go back to the plumbers here. Again, Nixon, when he's running in 1972, he's very pro-law and order. And his diplomatic successes overseas had been a major coup for him. He's done well in China. He's done well dealing with the Soviets. He has created trade agreements. So overall, his foreign and domestic policies have actually shown very positive movements. Crime was down. The hippie culture kind of ending this massive drug utilization throughout the country. So Nixon really starts to come out on a high note out of his first period presidency. One of the things, too, is what helps him is that an assassin tries to kill his number one competitor, George Wallace. Wallace does live. He's paralyzed, though, after the assassination again. As you can see, there's still turmoil in American politics to the point that violence is still out there being utilized. He then goes up and runs against McGovern, and McGovern is extraordinarily extreme. He's very, very liberal to the Americans, and so you have to understand, America has really shifted demographically and politically during coming out of the 1960s into the 1970s. You see this rise of what they call the Bible Belt, and the rise of the Christian right, as they call it too. So you see this very conservative base come rising up out of the South and Midwest of the United States that are kind of pushing back upon the liberal 1960s. So Nixon absolutely crushes McGovern in the presidential election. In fact, the only state that Nixon does not win is Massachusetts. So when you're looking at presidential elections, this is one of the most lopsided victories that has ever happened. And so McGovern is soundly beaten. Nixon is on a very high note. He's feeling like he has all the success and all the backing behind him. So he's prepared to go into his presidency, his second term, with a strong backing of the American people for his policies. But remember, we got to talk about the plumbers again. So the plumbers, as we talked about, they have been already spying on Nixon's people who work in Nixon's White House, that work in the FBI. He even starts spying on political opponents. He has people sneak into people's houses. Now, again, is Nixon directly doing this? That's where things get muddled, and when we get really into the Watergate scandal, we'll talk about this. But more often than not, presidents have farmed out these types of missions. So usually they have one of their subordinates who are controlling and running these affairs. Some people believe it was Nixon's attorney general who hired like G. Gordon Liddy. Other people believe it was just G. Gordon Liddy on his own. So there's a lot of controversy about what happens with this. So many people believe that Nixon didn't know directly about what was happening until later when he was told about it. But even then, he's culpable because he doesn't talk about it or explain himself to the media or turn these people in who are committing criminal activities under his administration. So these investigators, though, these plumbers, they start to create a large list of who could be his political enemies, also people who might be leaking. So they really start to go above and beyond what other presidents had done in the past with these kind of special investigative groups, because now they're actively engaging in criminal activity. Like I said, they're breaking into people's houses, and they're doing things that are just shady and blatantly illegal many times. Nixon's underlings also start using places like the IRS to investigate his political opponents. And Nixon, he's doing all this because, remember, the initial thing that came out is like Pentagon Papers and other things that he saw as a violation when they're leaking them of national security. So he wants to protect national security. That's his justification behind his actions when he is really pushing out and saying we need to solve these problems. He sees himself in the right because he's trying to protect the nation. So Nixon does not see what's going on as illegal or wrong. So one of the things that brings Nixon down is what is known as the Watergate scandal. So his plumbers were out working again, and they broke into the Democratic National Committee's office in the Watergate office building. This is why it's known as the Watergate Affair. And with that, they start looking for information, opposition research, who's working for the Democrats, what information they've compiled, who is working for them, so Nixon possibly or Nixon's minions can target them and try to dig up dirt on them too. And this group, of course, quite appropriately named, they're working for the committee to re-elect the president, the Creep Committee. So you have a bunch of guys who are sneaking around and digging around in the Democratic National Committee's office. And they are actually caught by a very observant security guard who calls them, and then they are arrested. And this is where the scandal really starts to come to a head. First off, And again, this is where things get cloudy when we talk about it. People like to put the Watergate affair in black and white. It's cloudy to know if Nixon knew about the break-in beforehand. What is apparent when you really look down into the investigation and the information that comes out, Nixon is aware of what happens afterwards. So nobody knows for sure if he was directly related to the first portion of it and planning of it, but he was definitely aware of after it happened. And things start to get a little dicey for Nixon because he starts doing things that are illegal in his sphere too, that he knows is illegal, and he starts creating these cover-ups. And this again is where the media starts to come into play. The Washington Post really takes the Watergate affair and starts pushing it heavily. In fact, the two main reporters that really bring down Nixon worked for the Washington Post. There's a couple of movies out there if you're really interested in finding out their side of how things worked. It's a kind of a fascinating look at it. So things start to happen all around Nixon that really impact and hurt him. First off, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, is caught taking bribes. He was found to be taking bribes when he was the governor of Maryland, and he continued to take those same bribes while he was still vice president. So he has to resign, and this politically hurts Nixon. Also, because of the resignation, instead of prosecuting him, Agnew was pretty much free to resign and leave. And this is where you get Gerald Ford, who's picked up as Nixon's vice president. With this, though, Nixon really thought with Agnew getting forced out, that was enough of a scandal and the controversies that Watergate would just be kind of swept under the rug. But it didn't. Instead, Democratic lawmakers really kept it alive and started to ask for more documents and really starts to push forward an investigation into what actually occurred at the Watergate Hotel. They start public hearings. So remember when we talked about McCarthy back doing his hearings, he broadcast them live on TV. Same thing happens with the Watergate hearings. They are directly televised into America's home, and everybody is watching these committee meetings. And the information that comes out is more and more damning to Richard Nixon on a continuous basis. G. Gordon Liddy, who's initially caught, and he's considered kind of the mastermind behind the Watergate break-in, is given a really severe prison sentence by the judge overseeing his trial. He's sentenced to 5 years off of a very first-time break-in offense, which is kind of unheard of. And what this leads to is many other of the individuals who were part of the Watergate break-in to start looking at the punishment that G. Gordon Liddy was given and starting to think of what their options were to avoid it. And this is where you start getting people who want to make deals. It comes to light that a lot of these people were in contact with people who were close to Nixon saying, well, if you get convicted, Nixon will pardon you, so don't worry about it. So again, Nixon is actively using his power as president to try to protect people that were engaged in these criminal activities. And what happens is that Sam Ervin really takes this to the head and really starts pushing out the Watergate scandal to the American people more and more. It doesn't die even after the conviction of the plumbers. More people want to know what Nixon knew about the crime. And so Nixon, he appoints a special prosecutor. And the special prosecutor was given very wide powers. He was able to investigate what he wanted to. And so he really starts digging around into this Watergate scandal and starts to find some documents that are related to Nixon that would be very damaging to him. And he finds these documents. He starts to find out that Nixon had a recorder in the Oval Office. So he comes to the conclusion that Nixon has his role actively recorded on the on the audio recordings themselves and starts demanding access to them. And Nixon gets really annoyed and he decides that he's going to start firing people. He orders, his attorney general resigns. Nixon gets a new attorney general. He tells him to fire the special prosecutor. He refuses. He resigns. Nixon's next attorney general, or the assistant attorney general, Nixon tells him to fire the special prosecutor. He refuses and resigns. This becomes known, what affectionately has been termed, the Sunday Night Massacre. And so it's starting to look like Nixon is actively trying to cover things up at this point, when he's trying to fire all those people who can investigate him. And so people really come to a conclusion here that Nixon was up to no good. With the recorder, too, Congress wanted access to it. And Nixon, he asserts something called executive privilege, which is his right as the president to deny access to any presidential documents. And this actually goes all through the kind of the three branches of government. So you have Nixon saying to Congress, so you have the president, the executive saying to the legislative, no, you can't investigate me, you can't have these documents. So where does it get kicked over to? It gets kicked over to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court forces Nixon to turn over the documents so that they could be reviewed. And the tapes, they do have some pretty damaging information on them, and then there's this mysterious 18-minute gap in the tape recordings that people truly believe were erased by Nixon to show his full understanding and knowledge of the cover-up. Basically, what comes out is, like I said earlier, it comes out that Nixon probably was not in the initial planning stages of the Watergate break-in, but he was definitely part of the cover-up, and he knew it was happening, and he refused to have the people who were engaged in doing these illegal activities arrested and tried for their crimes. And because of that, Nixon now becomes the criminal that he was trying to, say, well, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a crook. That's his famous thing when he pleads before the American people. He goes on television, he tells everybody, I'm not a crook. That's one of his famous lines. And the American people don't buy it. They believe that he was involved in criminal activity, and it was very obvious he was. So what happens at this time is Congress is left with its power to check the executive, and that is to impeach Nixon. Nixon initially thinks that he can survive this. He looks at it and goes, I might be able to get by this. The American people like me. They voted for me heavily. And then he starts talking with people in Congress and in the Senate, and he realizes that he does not have the support that he needs to survive an impeachment hearing. In fact, the writing on the wall was very apparent. Nixon was going to be kicked out of office. It was going to happen. He was going to be impeached. So on August 9, 1974, Nixon, in disgrace, resigns from the presidency and leaves the office, which then opens the door and we get Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford is our very first unelected president of the United States, which means he was not elected on the ticket with the vice president. So he was not elected to run the executive branch. He was just picked up later on. Overall, in the end, it does show that checks and balances do work, and that you can engage in criminal activity if it comes to light. And all too often, presidents have hidden behind executive privilege when there is something, even a hint of a controversy and a scandal that surrounds them. Why do we talk about this? Well, if you look at modern presidential politics, I think you in your lifetime are going to see multiple more occasions of events and scenarios like this. But it does go to show you that also paranoia can destroy somebody who had the popular backing of the American people, and he didn't need to engage in these activities. There's no reason for it. He was widely respected and revered up until that point, and instead he leaves office in disgrace. Nixon, though, when he does leave, he's often sought out by American political leaders later on about foreign policy decisions, helps many people that helped Nixon in his time as president, went on to greater roles and continued working close to presidents throughout their lifetime. Henry Kissinger is probably the biggest example of that. But overall, this goes to show you paranoia does not pay in the end. In fact, it'll get you arrested and put into jail. Again, one of the most controversial moments of any American presidency in history. All right, guys, make sure you do that assignment. After this, we are going to move on to the review, and we're going to do the test and the quiz, map quiz. Study that map. It's a difficult map. make sure you study that map. Go over it. It's in the stream. I will probably post it right before we do it too. Study the map. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow.